Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. As Paul very generously said, I'm Corey duBrowa, and I lead the BCW firm for the last 105 days or so. I spent the last, not that anybody's counting, I spent the last 15 years prior to that in chief communications officer roles at Google, at Salesforce, and at Starbucks. And I think you could call this session, there was a client of mine back in my former agency days, a woman named Linda Stone, who wrote one of the first papers on the impact of digital and social media. And she entitled that paper, Continuous Partial Attention. I think this panel could be very easily called, or this discussion could be called Continuous Partial Disruption. And to join me on the journey for exploring and discovering what continuous partial disruption is, I'd like to welcome Nick Thompson to the stage. So, Nick. I'm going to embarrass Nick for just a moment by giving you just a brief précis on his background, and then we'll get right into it. So Nick is the CEO of The Atlantic, which is a national treasure, and we're going to talk a little bit about his role at The Atlantic. It's a very different one from the one that he played at Wired, where he was editor-in-chief, and the role that he played at The New Yorker as senior editor. But in addition to those things, Nick has been a competitive runner for quite some time, and in 2021, he set the American record for men 45 over in the 50K race. 50K. That makes me tired just saying it, 50K. Nick is also currently building Speakeasy to encourage people to engage in positive and productive conversations, alongside writing a book on the way the mind of a runner works, which joins two other books that he wrote previous to that. Maybe we'll have a moment to talk about his moment as an author or his time as an author. But in any event, Nick, it's great to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thrilled to be here. I love.
Maybe we can start just by talking about your journey to a non-editorial role at The Atlantic, considering
Yes.
all the time that you've spent in a reportorial or editor kind of a seat, maybe what the differences are, or what even led you to that.
What led me to that? It's a little bit less of a stark transition than you might think. So I started out as a journalist, full-on journalist, writer, editor. I began because I didn't quite know what to do out of college, and went to Africa and got kidnapped and wrote about it, which was literally my start into journalism. But let's skip that, because it's not really relevant to this audience. I then became a journalist at the Washington Monthly. I just actually went back to talk to the young journalists there about my career path. And then it was a fairly steady progression of writing and editing, sort of up the journalistic food chain to where you want to be. So from the Washington Monthly, and then I did a bunch of stuff in newspapers, went to Legal Affairs, Wired, and then to the New Yorker. And when I was at the New Yorker, I thought I might have that job for the rest of my life. Right? There were senior editors there who'd done that for 30 years. Mm-hmm. But it was right at a moment of digital disruption in media, where the New Yorker, as the iPad came out, we wanted to build an iOS app, we wanted to have a fast digital strategy. And I was like the one guy on the New Yorker editorial team who could fix the printer, right? Like I knew a little bit more than everybody else.
It says more about the New Yorker than it says about you.
I'm seriously the only person there with a BS, right? So Remnick was like, you should run this stuff. And so I eventually just started to take on tech responsibilities. We built a paywall. I ran the product and engineering team. And so I built out experience doing that. And then I went back to Wired, and at Wired I also was in charge of the P&L, managing the product and engineering team. And so then I came to The Atlantic, and it's less of a shift than you might think, except now I oversee advertising, which I hadn't done before, and I don't oversee edit, which I had done before. So it's a shift, but it's more of an evolution than like a hard left turn.
So what about the skills that you developed on this journey led you to because I'm in the same boat in a way, thinking about being a CEO, having not been in that role before, but what skills did you accumulate that actually gave you the toolkit that you needed to do the role that you're doing now?
All right, well that starts with the supposition that I'm doing a good job, but let's I'll accept that supposition.
I'm generous like that, I'm good.
Thank you very much, Corey. There are a lot of skills that apply. Obviously, learning how to manage people, learning how to set strategy. I mean, the most important skill to being an effective CEO, I think, or the one I keep trying to work on the most, is there are 1,000 problems in the organization, right? And it's tempting to try to solve all of them. But to identify, with the time I have, the skills I have, and also very importantly, the skills that the organization have and where the organization is strong, where should I best spend my time? How can I allocate my attention, my time? Where do we need to put resources? Where do I need to put more attention? And I came into the Atlantic with certain notions of where that would be, and then over time they've evolved and shifted, and we've shifted the team a lot. But that was a skill I learned. I mean, in fact, in some ways, because I had a career where I was a writer, I was an editor, I was a manager, I ran the web, I had learned that. Like at the New Yorker, it didn't make any sense for me to write because the New Yorker had tons and tons of amazing writers, and they didn't have anybody who knew how to do like SEO. Right? So that was where I should spend my time. And I went to Wired, and Wired had far fewer writers, but they were actually better at SEO. So then it meant I should actually write more, right? And so learning that balance is something you take as a CEO where, okay, so of these 100 problems, which of these am I actually good at? Which of these do I need to apply myself to?
And which are most mission critical? Like, of the 1,000 problems, which 5 rise to the top as like must solve things?
Yeah, so what we did this year in the executive leadership team at the Atlantic, we said, okay, there are 4 things we're looking at. We're only going to think about these 4 things this year, not only really, but we're going to meet every Monday at 11 o'clock, and we're going to talk about our progress on these 4 things. Not the 5th thing, not just one thing, not something else next week. We're going to talk about these 4 things. And things ladder up, right? You have ladders into each of those things. And that has been a huge part of what has been a massively successful year for us.
Let's talk a little bit about the Atlantic and the heritage of the brand and the way that you kind of think about that. So long and storied history. In fact, did I read correctly? Did your father contribute to the Atlantic at one point?
He did. In 1966, he wrote one essay with his byline on it, one essay not on it, about Kwame Nkrumah's foreign policy in Ghana and then the foreign policy of Nigeria. Which tells you also something about the Atlantic. I mean, like big articles on West African foreign policy.
So how do you think about, something that your own family contributed to over the course of many decades, and how you're managing the brand today so that you both pay tribute to what came before, but that you're acknowledging or leaving room for today's technology or the things that must happen to be successful given how much publishing has changed?
Yeah, all right, so yeah, that's tough. All right, so part of it is easy, right? Like one of the advantages of the Atlantic is that I can tell a story of the Atlantic's history that is wholly positive, right? Like we're founded, like you could not, if you used GPT-4, you could not come up with a fake better history for a magazine. Like we're founded by abolitionists, right? Like before the Civil War, like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Harriet Beecher Stowe, like what could be better than that, right? We publish Martin Luther King, we publish some of the most important iconic essays in American history. We're an incredible brand, right? And so I can tell a story. We're in the National Portrait Gallery, our authors. Now, there are some moments we publish a bunch of stuff that rather not talk about, right? But you can leave that out of the history, right? So we've got an amazing, wonderful founding and brand. So that's an easy part of it. So telling the brand story is great. And actually, we were created to save American democracy, which is a story we can tell because that's our central focus right now.
That's a pretty good mission statement.
It's a good mission statement, right? And it ties back to 1857, so that's great. What's hard is anytime you have a history like that, you have to be quite conservative, right? You have to be very careful. You have to be very wary about moving forward into the next generation of publishing or this is how we think people are going to read in the future. We need to make a big change. Well, maybe we shouldn't make a change. We have to be protective. So I came in and I took the job because the prospect of trying to create a stable economic future for an institution this important is an amazing prospect. Like if I have a comparative skill in my life, it is identifying really important brands and helping fix their business models. Like that is what I have been best at in my life. And so the opportunity to apply that to the Atlantic was amazing because of all that I knew about and how much I cared about it. I grew up in Boston where the Atlantic used to be headquartered. So amazing brand, wonderful story, totally committed to it, but it also creates friction when you want it to evolve.
For sure. Speaking of friction, a little bit of a segue.
Bring it. Yes.
So you've been a reporter, an editor, you've been on that side of the house for many, many years. You're speaking to an audience of communicators. So these are people who either they work within companies, maybe they're instructing the communicators of the future, they work at agencies. What was maybe, I don't know if you want to answer it one way or the other, either the best relationship that you had with a PR person or the most intense relationship that you had with a PR person and why? Just to give us all a little peek behind the curtain of how that worked for you.
I can actually answer that. So I spent a lot of time with comms professionals and really respected them and thought they were very valuable to me, particularly when I was running Wired and I was writing more. And I would talk to them and I cared about my relationships with them a lot because I knew that they they knew things and they can verify things. And my goal for Wired was to have it to be the smartest, fairest, most accurate publication taking a hard look at tech. And so the most intense relationship was without question the dynamic I had with the comms person who was assigned to me from Facebook. So I was writing, and I wrote 25,000 words on Facebook, including a cover story with Mark Zuckerberg's face all beaten up. And it was about Facebook's evolution.
I remember this story.
Yeah. Well,
we talked about this story at another company.
I'm sure you did. And it was a story about Facebook trying to grapple with the aftermath of the 2016 election. And they, had a comms person who I just worked with because they knew this was, initially they tried to front run it and they tried to screw it up and they they did all the things to try to mess with it. And then eventually I think at some point they made peace that this was going to be a big story and their move should not be to undermine it, but to, apparently there's a debate in Comm Shop, which was should we try to front run it and mess it up? And I think they were trying to front run with the Washington Post, give details that they thought we had to them, or should we actually work with them and just try to make it accurate, right? And so that was read out to me by someone in the Comm Shop. But I developed this.
Okay, that's for those of you who do comms for a living, you're listening to this going, that is crazy town. You're talking to the reporter about should we front run the story or should we work with you? That seems like a thought bubble, not like a conversation.
Well, it was after they had made the decision to work with me that someone called and was they had a big debate about whether
we were going to do this thing, but now we're not. Okay.
Now we're not. But so what happened with this guy, and we became friends, is I would take the story and I would read him out loud, right? What I had written that would be I had 100 details that hadn't been reported before. I talked to tons of people at Facebook, and we developed a relationship of trust where I believed him if he said that's not true, right? And there were times where I was well, I heard that Cheryl said this in this meeting, and he's no. I was don't do that. He's okay, fine, you're right. I'm not going to even mess with you. You're right on that one, right? But it got to the point where I genuinely believed him, right? And so the way it works in a story is I'll talk to someone and they'll say, Corey said this in a meeting, right?
Yes.
And then I go to you and I say, hey, I have a source. They said, Corey said this in a meeting. And you say, that's false, right? And if I don't trust you, what I'll write is, person said Corey said this in a meeting, Corey denied it. Right? And that is completely accurate and that is fair by our rules.
Right.
Right?
Fair
if
point.
I do trust you, and we've built that trust, and you said I didn't say that, I will take that out.
You'll take it out, exactly.
Right? Because I will believe you, and I'll know that you know more and you're not lying to me. If I think there's a chance you're lying to me, then I'm going to put that in. And so the advantage of this person at Facebook, who ultimately was responsible for a story with the bloody Mark Zuckerberg on the cover, so maybe good, maybe bad, but I would read out loud everything in it. We would go through it, and they would say true, false, true, false. And you have to develop a trust that they're not going to front run you. You have to develop a trust that they're not going to BS you. And I think it's better for both sides.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
At what point did you know you had crossed the trust bridge?
I think it was that moment where he started laughing when I was don't mess with me on this one. I've got this one dead to rights. And he's you're right. Right? And I think we passed a moment of trust because his instinct had been, that's a tough fact. I'm going to try to deny it and see if I can come back with evidence to deny it. And then I was don't bother. So he has the trust that I've really got that one.
Right.
And then I have the trust that he doesn't actually have the opposite. He's going to go fish for it. And so it's why waste anybody's time here? And once I remember that conversation. I remember I was in a hotel room, and I remember the hotel room I was in when we had that conversation. I remember laughing after that moment, and I think that was a good moment.
So well, it's funny, I'm just thinking as you're talking about this, Mark Leibovich, who you would probably know from days gone by, when I worked with him and he was at the Washington Post doing a profile, he said, there is one thing you will know about me. You will know that you have pissed me off when you end up in my story. So my objective whenever working with Leibovich was always don't be in the Mark story for sure. So
very funny.
Speaking of trust bridges. Okay, since this is your obligatory conversation about AI, I think we should go into the conversation about AI. And so maybe we can start just with, it has a lot of limitations now. Sure. As my former boss at Google used to say, we're in the first inning of a very long game. He was a cricket person, so that was his way of describing it. So how do you think about the limitations of AI today, whether you agree it's a spreadsheet or machine learning or actual technology, as it applies to your editorial team, your newsroom?
Well, all right, so I'm the CEO, I'm not the editor-in-chief. I don't have any say over the editorial team. If I told the editorial team...
Division of Church and State Yes.
In fact, if any of you have a horrible fact about your company and you really don't want it in the Atlantic, tell me, because that will poison it for the editorial team. Then they can't report it.
That's a helpful fact.
Yeah. So I don't have any say over what they do, but I can talk about how I do it personally, right? I'm
Yes.
writing a book about running.
Yes.
I love it, right? I wrote a whole book for my kids about the Animal World Cup, right? And I had GPT-4 write national anthems for the Slug soccer team against the Bear soccer team, and I had DALL-E create the images, right? And I printed it out and gave it to my 9-year-old for his birthday, right? It's amazing. On the book I'm writing about running, I have a series of prompts that I use for things that I know are wrong in my writing style. Like, please, scan this section, look for, unnecessary use of the passive voice, word repetitions within this distance, and offer me, suggestions in the style of Strunk and White to tighten the prose, right? Or, please offer 3 other possible physical descriptions that basically trying to come up with creative prompts that would give editorial suggestions. I would never take a sentence or take a line, but I would.
Prompt engineering.
Prompt engineering, just
Yes.
efficient prompt engineering to help me be a better writer in my book. I don't use it all the time, but I do think it's very helpful. It's going to become more and more helpful. So that's me personally. I feel like for every single person in the room, this is so important. You should be using it every day, right? For something or other, right? There are all kinds of things you can learn for it. Just to test and explore, you should be trying the different models. I sent a note to my team back in March, and I said, look, I don't know where this is going. I don't know what's going to happen. I am very confident it's going to be important. Please learn. Just try, experiment, right? So that's personally.
Yes.
On the business side of things,
Yes.
I think we're very enthusiastic about it. So we have you've put one of our best engineers and fully on AI. We've started working with that outside firm to start figuring out AI experiments we can run. I can't talk about what they are publicly, but we have built a bunch of tools that are helpful for how we do our job. Actually, one that's cool that will be useful for comms professionals is we're trying to build a tool, it's complicated, that will make sure that all of our sponsored content is compliant with FTC rules, right? That's a useful tool to have.
Very useful.
Right? And it's a thing that comes up, and our lawyers, often late at night have to go through, but you can just feed through. These campaigns are ones we've run that are compliant. These are rules. Please evaluate new one. Tell us whether you think it's compliant, right?
Yes.
And then you can identify. So we have 5 or 6 projects like that we're running on the business side. On the editorial side, they're not going to touch it because of the question you asked 3 minutes ago, right? The risk, right? And
Right.
if the Atlantic were to publish a story that had a sentence that had been pulled from OpenAI, there's a legal rights issue. Then what do we have the future rights to that? Did we write that? And secondly, it just makes you look terrible, right? And we have this incredible brand. So we're not touching it on the editorial side for now. No one's using it the way I'm using it, even to think about copy editing things.
Right.
We're not using it for that. So it's lots of experimentation and then, rightful caution. Then I should say the other thing, this is maybe not totally germane, but we are massively trying to figure out, or we are spending a lot of time trying to figure out the effect on our business, right? Particularly what happens as, search, we talked about this before, what happens as search transitions more towards barred? What does that do to our audience mix? Okay, if it's going to change our audience mix, how do we choose our product strategy to reflect what we think the future audience mix will be? So we are trying to map how we'll change our industry and then how our business responds to it.
The artist formerly known as SEO. How do we think about what that bridge kind of looks like?
What that bridge looks like. And then, even if we don't know how to monetize that artist formerly known as SEO, if you were just to take away X% of it for certain queries, and we've done a pretty sophisticated model of what it will do, how does that change everything else you do? And then, of course, how do you partner with the different AI platforms and foundation models to choose which ones you're going to work with closely and which ones you're not.
That's right.
Yeah.
So what you're describing, the way that my brain conceives of it is what at Google we used to call a dog food strategy. You're making your own dog food, right? You're taking your own products, you're taking generally available software products, you're giving them a specific applicable form of use, and then you're turning them loose on your people to basically fail as fast as possible, learn as quickly as possible. It just struck me as you were describing this. How many of you subscribe to Casey Newton's Platformer? Anybody a Platformer subscriber here? I can highly recommend it. I can also recommend Ben Thompson's Stratechery. We're going to talk about your LinkedIn in a minute, which is amazing. But Casey talked specifically in last night's Platformer about a custom GPT just for copy editing.
Yeah.
Just for copy editing. Now bear in mind, Casey is basically a 2-person shop. It's himself and somebody that he hired from his journalism life. And he's publishing 4 days a week, right? So I mean, there's a big stream of content, but it's learning about him as it goes, and that's sort of what you're describing, is that whether it's happening in newsrooms, whether it's happening inside of our companies, whether it's happening in the academic world, we're failing as fast as we can with these tools. And oh, by the way, I mean, OpenAI literally just had their first very live conference this week to talk about their software developer kit and what people are doing with that. So this custom GPT world that I've described is where I think we're all headed to, in a way.
We're all headed towards that. You know, when I was at the New Yorker, so 10 years ago, I had the dream that we would take all the New Yorker's copy edits and train a model that would then copy edit like a New Yorker, and I named it Goldstein, which is the name of our chief copy editor. And Remnick loved it, but knew that the staff would hate it, so I hired a developer and had them work on a different floor. It just wasn't. It wasn't ready for prime time, but it was well ahead of its time. You know.
So you talked before about the Atlantic's archives. There are troves of material, very important material dating back a long time ago. How do you, is one of the things you're thinking about, not you personally, but your editorial team thinking about, and then there's a business ramification for this, linking the stories of the past, things that you wrote very authoritatively on, when I say you, I mean the royal you, decades ago, and you're now bringing into the present or into the current or even into the future, maybe even using some of these tools. Is that like a live discussion?
There is definitely a live discussion. I mean, so probably, you know, there were like 3 things I did when I came in day one, and number 1 was we have to digitize these archives because they weren't available. And I had seen the uptick that we had. I had helped oversee the digitization of the New Yorker's archives, and it just seemed like obvious, right? And it's a one-time cost, but it pays back, you know, many times over very quickly. So we're looking at these archives. It's useful it's great for the brand. You want to like, well, we ran this essay by George Orwell that I hadn't read about. There are a couple things you can do with it. One, so A, it gives you more content you can license to these large language models. B, you're trying to get people to circulate through your site, and you can find, using AI models, like when we're building tools, identify story from the archive that new subscriber may not know about, but that will make them want to read, right? And if you can get better at that, then the key challenge for us is when someone subscribes, how do you deepen the relationship? We want you to subscribe, and then we want to deepen the relationship. So if we can find the right archival story, that's even better. So we do a lot to do that, and then there's IP. If we can identify, using whatever tools we have, hey, this is a story we wrote in 1933 that we've completely forgotten about that would make a good movie or a podcast, there's a huge economic opportunity there. So we haven't figured out step 3. You know, we barely figured out step 2. Step 1 we're working on, but yes, it's a huge opportunity.
IP seems like it's such a huge part of this conversation. So when I was still at Google, the YouTube team was already crafting what they called, and have since renamed, I don't think they like the title for it, the AI Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
And what they were doing was basically having an attribution conversation with all of these like major labels in music, houses that produce films, things that end up on YouTube that aren't inherently like creator driven, where they were thinking a lot about this notion of attribution, right? Which is where maybe lawyers immediately go to. Like, you know, when you're building a large language model, theoretically it's ingesting everything, including the Atlantic's intellectual property, including Wired's intellectual property. How as a publisher do you think about that, given how quickly the technology is moving and how vast these LLMs are?
Well, okay, so I'll argue it 2 ways. One is, what the hell? Like they disguised their bots that crawled our sites. They crawled our sites, they didn't tell us, they ingested it. We're like, I don't know, the Atlantic is the 21st most commonly cited source in, you know, the model that Google used. Like, they didn't pay, they didn't ask, like, what the hell, right? Like, I can be extremely resentful, and in fact, Facebook's Llama model, partly based on the Books 3 database, my book about the Cold War is in that database, right? Like, and nobody asked, nobody got the rights. It was just somebody had made a pirated version of my book and stuck it in the database. It makes me very angry. On the other hand, like, my book in that database is not in order. It's just words put out of order, right? These models are not actually like reading the Atlantic cover to cover. They're just like dumping the words in.
That's right.
And
billions of words of text.
And billions of words of text just like dumped in there. And it's learning from that. You know, we wouldn't stop someone from coming into a library and reading all of the Atlantic, or like just scanning the Atlantic word for word and not even reading it, because that's a quicker way to do it. So I can see how this is going to be a very intense and legal debate. The way I would like through it, my my desired outcome is for us to, at The Atlantic, have a couple of trusted partners that we work with that, compensate us, that we have a business deal with, but where we're also, I don't want us to be in a situation where we're like, screw you, you stole our stuff, pay us. And like that antagonistic dynamic, I don't think is efficient for anybody. So I'm trying to I'm hopeful that we can find a happy medium.
I would love to put some friends of mine at Google on the phone with you just so that they can feel good about that conversation. Yes, this is not antagonistic. This is a good dialogue. There is a lot of antagonism built into that.
Well, totally, because there's a lot of money at stake,
right?
I mean, and the journalism industry knows that it's going to lose a ton of money because of this. We've modeled out how much money we're going to lose because of this. And but does that give us a right to an equal amount of money? No, transformation happens.
Right.
So.
Yeah, like web traffic, for example, and this bridge we described before where you're going from an SEO model to one that's driven more by whatever custom GPT you have, there will definitely be web traffic results that look wildly different than they did even 6 months ago.
Right, and so it's my job to adapt to that, but also to it's a little bit like there were parts of the publishing industry that got incredibly mad at Google and at Facebook for taking our traffic, right?
Yes.
And was that actually fair? Or we should be the fights right now are whether you should be paid for links, right? And I can see why publishers want that, right? Anytime you can get paid, that's good, and it supports you to do good work that is good for American democracy. But is there a justification for that? So that's a little shakier.
Right, what is naturally evolutionary change versus what has sort of been inflicted upon? How do you draw that line?
Yeah, so actually, maybe the most specific way is that with the advertising market, there's some people in the news industry who are like, Google and Facebook stole our ad business. And I'm a little bit or they outcompeted us, right? We had a really good ad product that worked. If you wanted to find people who like tech, they would subscribe to Wired. And then Google built a thing where you could advertise people who like tech because they've searched for the word tech, right? That's a better way to reach these people. Do they have to pay us for that? It's a stretch.
Right, efficiency models.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little about regulation. Obviously, the Biden administration literally just had an executive order about the specific parameters of AI. Now, one of the last things I did at Google was the usual suspects. This was Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, and Anthropic were summoned to the White House to have a discussion with the vice president and her team about a variety of different parameters. So you could see even in that moment, and this is spring, that they were conceiving this kind of executive order. It just took a while for it to come out. How does this affect your world? How should we think about what the common impacts of this kind of regulatory step, an executive order, what does it mean?
Right. Well, it's an executive order, so it doesn't mean that much.
Right.
There's, in an executive order.
I feel like I'm answering my own question. Sorry, Nick. I didn't mean to set you up that way. But what are the longer term implications of it?
Well, okay. So the executive order. So there are a bunch of things about it that are really interesting. So. Executive order has the power of procurement, has the power of example, has the power of Biden just saying this, which can affect the news. And there are a couple of areas where that applies, right? We're going to really study the way that it affects job changes. We're going to set up this process to deal with misinformation. The process to deal with misinformation is 600 days if you add up the different components of it. We have this, basically, we've identified the most important issues in AI, and we, the federal government, care about them, and we are going to use our procurement powers. We're going to try to watermark our government AI images. All of that is relatively limited impact, but unambiguously good. The one part of the executive order that actually matters is where they use the Defense Production Act, so an actual real law, which maybe they don't have the legal authority to use, and they say that anybody in tech who's building a foundation model has to red team their model and send the results to the federal government. And that sounds really good, but I actually think it's probably bad. And I think it's probably bad because what it does is it very early in the evolution of this tech will set up a requirement that anybody who builds a foundation model have 1 million lawyers, which means it will limit it to just your friends who were there at the White House in April or May, which was their intention, I would suggest. Not that you were in favor of this, but one of the reasons all the tech companies—
We didn't set the list, to be fair.
It's just the thing that happened, and it happened to be in the interest of these very wealthy people who give lots of money to these politicians.
25%, 25%, 25%.
I think that's right, and I don't want to ascribe totally cynical motives, but I do think that the big tech companies really wanted regulation because a regulation like this red teaming regulation will make it much harder for upstart competitors. And so it will lock in their position at a crucial moment. And if AI develops in such a way that there are 4, 5, 6 foundation models that are capturing most of the economic value created. That is great for those companies. And so on the one hand, you should red team these models. You probably should have some kind of verification. The government should be setting some kinds of standards, but you really, really need to have a competitive market if you want the United States to have an advantage here, if you want this to develop in the best way possible. So it is a hard, hard, hard issue. Overall, I give credit to the Biden administration for the executive order. Overall, I think it will be good for the development of AI. I do very much worry about competitive lock-in.
So there are people sitting in this audience for sure that would represent the interests of like startup companies, you know, people who maybe they have the GPUs, the processing power to actually make some of these models work. Maybe they don't, maybe they're standing in line like everybody else. But I mean, what advice might you give to the Bidens to make sure that that universe is also included in the future? Because if 4 companies are literally going to be the parameters through which the entire industry is seen, then it will develop in a somewhat predictable way rather than the way innovation usually develops, which is takes a long time and then all at once.
Yep.
I think a famous author said that.
There are a couple things they can do. So part is in the executive order. So the executive order has a couple provisions about providing government data to startups. That is very useful, right? Opening government data sets to academics, to researchers. Like one of the problems right now is Google has all the data, right? So Google can train its models on that data, right? Twitter has all your tweets, which is great, great data for it. Nobody else has access to those. So the government providing data that is available to startup companies, that is a really good thing. And then using competition policy, right? And so even if you're creating a little barrier here, using your authority through the FTC, through your DOJ investigations, through your other rulemaking as you make agreements with these companies that mandates competitive policies, I suppose that's the way to go.
That's a good theory.
Yeah,
we'll have to see what happens in the next year, which leads me to an interesting question. 2024.
Yes.
There are more than 40 national elections happening all over the world, according to the latest scale of people who keep track of these things. That creates an environment rife with potential for mis and disinformation. So at our shop, we have developed a tool called Decipher that uses cognitive AI to basically go to an organization, rank their potential mis or disinformation threats, layer Gen AI on top of that to message to those threats. So in other words, a tool to help decipher what your needs may be and how to avoid that in a year in which a lot of those things will be coming. How does a newsroom think about that same dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most important dynamics in the next year or two will be trying to identify and not getting sucked into AI-created false narratives right now. So the way we think about it is just being extremely careful about verification, right? Mandating that we are very slow in. Like one of the nice things about The Atlantic is that we don't feel an obligation. Like we didn't have to write a story about who had bombed the hospital in Gaza because we don't have to be right on.
Breaking news isn't your coin of the realm.
And that's where you're going to get tricked, right? Or that's the most likely place where you're going to get tricked or where you're going to publish something false. Now, we could also get tricked in a deeper way by a deepfake audio. There's a huge risk of hacking that is going to be increased. So I don't think I have a particular insight in how we're thinking of it, except that we are well aware, and I think everybody should be aware, that there's a risk of fake news, right? Of like AI-generated false news.
Yeah.
There's a risk that a false story about your CEO, or perhaps about you, since you are the CEO, will spread because someone will be able to take a video of, create a video that makes it look like you. I mean, we're seeing this in Britain in the labor politics where like it's a fake voice, not fake video.
Right.
And then there's the additional problem, and this is the interesting thing about the Israel-Hamas conflict in Palestine, which is that there are no, as far as I know, there are no serious stories that have been created with AI that are false. But AI has been used, but the claim of that's AI has been used to deny everything that's true. Right? So it will also be the case that you will have a true narrative that people won't believe because they'll say it's AI. And one of my favorite paradigms for the internet, Zeynep Tufekci wrote this for us when I was at Wired, was you think about a high-trust society. And a high-trust society is like this room, right? I left my briefcase. I don't even know where it is, right? It has my laptop. It has all kinds of stuff in it, right? This is a high-trust society. I'm pretty confident and allows me to have this comfortable conversation without right? Low trust society, I don't trust, right, that my briefcase is there. Like if I was in a low trust environment, right, if I was in Union Station, right, it's a little more of a low trust.
You would have it under your chair.
I'd have it under my chair, right? And the internet is becoming every part of the internet. Like Reddit has always been a little bit of low trust. They're like every area has high trust versus low trust. LinkedIn is more high trust, Twitter is more low trust.
Right.
But the whole internet is going to become more and more low trust. And when you have a low trust environment, everything is harder.
Yes.
Every single interaction is harder. And so we are about to enter an environment, the internet, where it's more and more low trust, and that's not good.
So I want to talk about your presence on the internet, which is one of my favorite things about LinkedIn. For those of you who have not seen my friend Nick's regular video series on LinkedIn, The Most Interesting Thing in Tech, it's awesome. It comes with its own set of risks, I think, because you're very run and gun. This is like, it's a thought you have, you're on the street, literally most time, that's the scene that people see you in.
Yep.
How do you think about managing, because this, whether you would articulate it this way or not, this is managing the Nick Thompson brand.
Yep.
And yet the Atlantic probably sits somewhere around or underneath that. How do you think about those things either commingling, or do they commingle in your mind? Is this just a purely authentic representation of what you are when you're not doing Atlantic things? Or how do you do that?
Yeah, so I think of it as the Nick Thompson brand. It's me, right? And it is like that particular video series. Like there are a bunch of things that I do on my own, right? And I run these races, and I write this book, and I'm doing this thing on LinkedIn, and I'm on other social platforms. And that's just me, right? And whether I was working at the Atlantic or working at Wired or working at McDonald's, I would like do the same things. And part of what makes the LinkedIn video work is that that's kind of clear. Like I've done it the same way. The shtick for the last 6 years, or the thesis or the hypothesis, has been wherever I am on a certain day, if I have an interesting thought about what's something that's going on in tech, I will just, like I have my tripod in the briefcase, wherever it is. I'll like take my phone, put it in the tripod, put in my AirPods, and then talk.
Fire.
So today, I talked about Kai-Fu Lee's new AI model in China in comparison to Grok, Elon Musk's new AI model. And I happened to be in a little park by a statue of Longfellow on 18th Street before going to Washington Monthly offices, and just filmed it right there. And it has a couple of benefits. One, it's fun. Two, it forces me to continue to follow the tech news and continue to like keep my presentation skills up, because you have to, you are talking into a camera. I try to do it in one take. And then it's also like, it's the LinkedIn community, so it's like a lot of people I deal with on the business side.
Right.
It is important. I do not put it on Twitter, and I don't put it on Twitter because that's where all the journalists are, right?
Yes.
And so, like, that would be risky, right? I mean, maybe there are all kinds of things that could go wrong when you're like, I was just in the Washington Monthly, and
Twitter. What could go wrong on Twitter? Any ideas?
well,
anybody?
In fact, this is the reason I started it on LinkedIn as a conversation, and this was Dan Roth, who runs editorial at LinkedIn. He's a friend of mine, and we were just talking about it, and I had the realization that at LinkedIn, because you're tied to your identity and because there's a picture, like no one says anything bad on LinkedIn because it's tied to your professional identity. You can't create an egg account.
For the most part.
For the most part, right? There's very little. The conversations are much better.
Yes.
And when I started to, this was like 10 years ago, I started to realize the difference in conversations. It was like just sort of one of the foundational realizations that structure and form shape everything downstream. And so the structure and initial decisions that LinkedIn made had some drawbacks, but they also made it much easier to post dorky videos and have good conversations than on Twitter.
So you told me that the last time you and I saw each other before this time, you told me a great story about something that happened in the background of one of your videos that you were unaware of until user comments came through. And then it became obvious to you that like, oh shit, there is something happening behind. Maybe tell our esteemed audience
this happens.
what that was.
So what happens is I'm on the street, right? And I'm filming, and then I post it, and then I don't look again for a while because I go back to whatever I'm doing next. And so this particular video, which I think might have been the day before I had lunch with you, I'm on Mercer Street. Like I'm in front of Brunello Cucinelli. I'm in like a nice spot, right? I'm in Soho.
Theoretically, a pristine place to shoot a video. Brunello
Pristine
Cucinelli.
place. And I like set up my little tripod, and I stand on the sidewalk, press go, and step back, talking to the camera. And, oh no, I'm facing the other way. And then I post it, and then 6 hours later, or maybe I get a text from my little sister. Apparently there's a guy who like goes pee, like just like doesn't know I'm there, but like a regular, like decent looking guy just like decides to go pee by the truck, like in full view.
As one does on Mercer Street, I guess, sure.
And it's like in the video, it's posted online, but all kinds of like hilarious stuff happened. And the other day I filmed one in Washington Square Park, and my kids just were laughing so hard because there's a guy who's like clearly like high as a kite. and I'm talking about whatever I'm talking about, and behind me, while I'm running through Biden's executive order or something, the guy behind me is like, like kids were doing that to me that night. Like,
it's a wordless j'accuse. Yeah.
So, but it's fun. It's just a slice of life, and like part of the idea is I'm just filming where I am, and whatever happens, happens.
So there are a number of people in the audience whose role it is, at least in part, to do what you're doing kind of for yourself for the bosses in their companies, whether they work in-house or whether they work at a firm and they're counseling clients. Are there any lessons that you've learned through this experience? I mean, it has been, like you said, 6 years now. So aside from maybe the Brunello Cucinelli may not be the place I thought it was, but aside from that lesson, like, what should people think about in terms of because the thing people would say, or I would say to you, Nick, is that it's super authentic. Like, I've known you through multiple Nick eras. This is 100% you.
Right.
And it's hard as a leader, as a CEO, to do that, but you're pulling it off. So I think this crowd would love to know, like, is there a formula, or is this just your instincts are just super infallible and it's working out great for you?
I mean, it might be a certain amount of luck. I did happen to choose a platform where it works. It did happen to develop an audience. It just sort of did happen to come together in a way that was good, and it's never gone horribly wrong. There's also the hypothesis that maybe it's not good, right? Like, I'm supposed to be CEO of The Atlantic out there selling ads, representing the brand, and I'm in my running shorts, right? Like, filming videos in front of graffiti and like on Rivington Street, right? Like, I don't know. There are probably people who think it's not the best idea. But for folks who, I mean, maybe the lesson is, if there is a lesson, it might be the obvious lesson that whoever you're working with, like, actually figure out what they do like and what they are, what comes naturally. Like, the reason I do this is because I enjoy it and because it feels natural and because it is me. If it was forced, if I was doing it because someone 5 years ago had told me I should do this, I would not have done it for 5 years. I would have stopped it when they left or when I switched jobs or some other point. I do it because I enjoy it and because it's me. And so if you can find that for whoever you work with, then that's great.
I think your joy must be in curiosity, because it strikes me, having watched many of these videos over the years, that like your narrative is getting to the bottom of something, or maybe not getting to the bottom of something.
Totally. And that's partly why I became a journalist and why this career works for me, which is I just like to learn new things. And the critique of me from teachers, parents, everybody has always been, you do too many things. Like, you need to focus and decide on exactly this, right? And like, I've always wanted to do lots of things and learn lots of things, and this is a way of doing that.
Very cool. We're going to play a little word association game here.
Okay.
But before we do, there's one last question that I wanted to ask you.
What do you associate?
Yeah, Mercer Street. That'll be one of the words for sure, although it's 2 words. Is there a story of which you are particularly proud that either you wrote or you edited? And like, what defines being proud of a story aside from like it breaks through that magic mirror where like your parents say like that was actually great, which doesn't happen, at least in my world, that often?
Well, the story, I mean, I'll tell you the story of the best thing I think I ever wrote, which was the essay about, I'd written an essay about, it's a complicated essay, but it's about my life in running, and it's about learning to understand my, how my sort of intense running experiences post age 40 helped me understand my father. And I wrote it, and I wrote a draft, and it was pretty good. I'm the editor-in-chief, and if you're the editor-in-chief and you write something pretty good, the machine just puts it on the internet, right? And says, good job, boss. But instead, this editor, Vera Titunic, she'd been my executive editor at The New Yorker. She'd come with me to Wired. I adore her. She's like, no. Like, you need to make this part better. And she's like, and you need to go deeper, and you're hiding something, right? And I was like, no, I'm done. I have others. And she's like, no. And she really pushed me and really forced me to go through why I sort of cared about a certain thing and thought about a certain thing. And then I really pushed on all the sort of most important parts of the piece. And at the end, what I finished with was 10 times better than what I had been willing to put on the internet. And it was all because of Vera just saying, you really have to do this, and you really have to understand this. Like, your father is not coming through, and you are saying he made you do this, but I don't believe you and I don't understand it. And so you have to explain it. And she just, like, I would get drafts back, and she would just have go deeper, like in the margins. And it's ended up, something I'm very proud of. That's the base of the thing I'm,
well,
now
first
trying
of
to
all,
make a book.
it's a hell of a story. For those of you, just go Google it or use the search engine of your choice. But yeah, go find it. But it's an amazing story. Do you attribute this to because of your relationship with Vera, or is it just she's such a fine editor that it could have been Jill Smith that turned this into her and she would have been like, nope, not authentic, go?
I think she really knew me. We'd worked together for years. We had tons of trust. It's not easy. Like, I'm the boss. She reports to me. I choose her salary.
Totally.
Right? So that creates weird dynamics. But we'd worked together for years. So. Wish she'd come work at the Atlantic, but she went back to the Times. Boo.
Yeah. Hate it when that happens. Okay, little game of word association.
All right.
I'm going to say a word. Nick's going to say words back to me. That's how it works. Okay.
Do I say one word or do I have multiple words?
However many words you like.
Great.
Yeah,
okay.
It's up to you. But it's like what this means to you. So
Sure.
AI.
Monopolies.
This is going great, don't you think? I like how this is going so far. Okay, quantum computing.
Everything.
Wired.
Recovering.
Cold War.
Cold War. Oh, I thought you said Cole Porter.
This talk.
Learn more from Kennan.
It's good. Election.
Nervous.
Running.
Deadline.
Atlantic.
Thriving.
Beautiful. We're going to do an old school thing for a conversation that was ostensibly about new school things, which is we're going to pass the mic over to you all. And I hope that you have questions for our guest, because he's got lots of answers. Maybe while we're sending the mic around and figuring out who wants to ask the first question, you told me something really cool that you were working on with a former employer of mine that's like sort of a special edition or something like that.
This is great.
I would love for you to talk about that, because again, I feel like for many comms professionals in the room, this is, and by the way, I had nothing to do with this, okay? Like full disclosure, I was long gone when this great idea came up, so this is purely down to Nick and team's genius and working with my former colleagues.
Yeah, this is wonderful. So Google obviously cares a lot about stories about AI and how AI is told, and I have lots of friends at Google, and I had said the thing that interests me the most in AI is trying to identify the unanswered questions in AI. Like, what are the things that we don't know, right? Like, how will AI change our understanding of human consciousness? Like, what will happen when you start to train AI models on synthetic data? And so for the last few months, I've been trying to come up with lists of like, what are the questions that smart people disagree on, right? What is the, how do open source AI models fit into this future? And Google said, well, you know what, why don't we make a magazine like that? Why don't we make a magazine about these questions? And of course, there's a complicated dynamic where Google will have slightly different ideas for the magazine than, we will. But not that much if you start with this premise, right? Because Google wasn't saying, if Google had said, you should make a magazine about why Bard is better than OpenAI.
Right.
Like, that's not, like, we'll work on that on like a client, like the branded content studio will work with like a client-partner relationship, but
Totally.
it won't actually be, I'm not gonna work on that.
No.
We'll execute the task, but like this task was really fun. And so we went out there and we said, okay, so we had some conversations with Google, and then we assigned a bunch of stories, and we got, we had the former editor of the New Yorker's cartoon section writing about why it's hard for AI to be funny, which is a really interesting challenge. Like, there's certain things that these AI models, we had Maria Konnikova, who wrote for me at the New Yorker and Wired and became the #2 ranked female poker player in the world, write about why AI can't win at poker, right? It can win chess, can win Go, but can't win poker, right? And playing against the best AI poker models. And so we got beautiful art, we got amazing writers, and we made this killer magazine that Google likes because it raises these interesting questions about AI, and that we like because it's a wonderful magazine. It's separate from the Atlantic's editorial. It's called Dialogues. It looks gorgeous because the design team we have at the Atlantic's branded content studio is awesome. It's going to be distributed soon, and it's really astonishingly good. It's gorgeous. I hope you all get a copy of it. I wish it was out and I could give you all copies of it, but it's just great.
I can't wait to see that. I mean, again, I just think about Google's mission, right? The idea of discovering the world's information and making it universally accessible and useful. Like, that's the mission statement, but that's actually what you just described in magazine form, which is really cool when that serendipity or that Venn diagram actually occurs.
Yeah, it's a branded content is complicated, has its own dynamics, but sometimes it's just awesome, and this was awesome.
Yes, sir.
Test. Great conversation. If The Atlantic was to launch your own AI, what would be the business model?
So an AI that does, like, I can come up with any AI? Sure, okay, so in a hypothetical world, I would have a business model where we use all the knowledge of the Atlantic, the training data of the Atlantic to help you write like a Atlantic writer, and we'll charge you a subscription fee. We're not going to do that, but I mean, that would be a model that I would really like. I mean, the thing I did try to build was, less based on the Atlantic, but it was, can you build a conversational platform where you use AI to drive people to productive conversations so that it identifies when a conversation is going haywire. So it elevates comments that you'll learn from but might disagree from. So it ranks the commentary on the platform based on what is most informative, not based on what triggers the most extreme reaction. And long, complicated story, but we're selling the tech from that product off, and we weren't able to build it into a massive social platform. But that was less Atlantic related, and that was more just a dream I had.
I'd pay for that. Other questions? Hi.
Hello. Question I had for you was, what's your take on disclosure in terms of agencies, for example, utilizing ChatGPT AI to facilitate day-to-day account work, right? I mean, should there be a line of transparency, and not only for your customers or your clients, but also your audience overall?
I'm assuming you're asking me and not Nick, but
both of y'all,
yeah,
whoever.
It would apply to both of us. I mean, from an agency perspective, I think that's coming. I think you have to. I think that was the discussion that we were having inside of Google, not that Google's an agency, but Google has obviously many customers. It's that there needs to be some form of disclosure where it's clear. And I think there's already a precedent for this in the editorial world. I've certainly seen it where, GPT or other generative devices are being used from a repertorial point of view or a content creation point of view, and that's made clear. I just think that's the bargain that you strike with clients. There needs to be the trust that Nick spoke about before. Part of building that trust is being fully transparent about the way in which the work gets done. It's one person's view, but that's mine.
Totally. I agree. If I'm making something for you and I use GPT and it writes some of the sentences, you have to absolutely disclose that for legal and other reasons. I also think that anybody who's building an AI model that in any way could be seen as impersonating a human or like a human should absolutely have to disclose that, and that we need government regulation as strong as possible, and we need norms. Like Google, the talk thing, what's the Google, the thing that will make the restaurant reservations for you and sounds like a human?
Oh yes.
Right,
well,
discloses that it's an AI.
Yes, it does.
When we use AI to read our stories at the Atlantic, right, we have a partner with 11 Labs. You can listen to our stories. We will say this is an AI. Anytime someone can be confused if it's an AI or human, you have to say it's an AI. That goes back to the high trust, low trust environment. Every single time, in all cases, always.
Great question. Thank you. Other questions?
Right here.
So the San Francisco Press Club is right now deciding whether or not we should give an award for you. Ahem. The San Francisco Press Club is trying to determine if we should award using AI in newsrooms for our upcoming gala awards. I was wondering, as someone who may be thinking about this, do you think any sort of designation or awarding should be done for that?
You mean give an award to the newsroom that used it in the best way?
Yeah.
Like best use of AI in
to
a newsroom?
do a FOIA request or something like that.
Totally, 100%.
Yeah.
Love it. Do it. It's great.
You can help me win an argument. Thank you.
Okay. I mean, I can explain
speak up
why.
a little, Nick? Yeah, you can just hand it over to them.
There are bad uses of AI, and there are good uses of AI. Like creating a tool in your newsroom to make FOIA requests more efficient is a good use of AI, right? Like using AI to write 70% accurate stories about things that happened in San Francisco is a bad use of AI. And newsrooms need to learn about. What I don't want is I don't want a news environment where it's like, they're bad uses. These things hallucinate. We'll never touch it, right? I don't think that's good for our industry.
Right.
So if you can incentivize the good uses while making it clear there are also bad uses, you've done great work.
Who's the arbiter of truth?
In what sense?
In terms of unregulated and unverified content online. Creating this low trust environment. What role can AI play for content verification and validation?
Yeah, I think that, if I talk to my kids a lot about like what they could do in their life. If I were to say like, what job will provide the most social value to the world over the next 5 years, I would think that someone who's using AI for content verification would be in that category. There'll be so many incentives for people on the other side, and I think that, a good guy with an AI stop a bad guy with an AI, like I really think is an important phenomenon, and I think that we need to do that as much as possible. So who is the arbiter of truth? I think it'll be companies who build tools to identify what's real. It'll be journalistic organizations that uphold their duties to try to vet. It'll be government agencies, it'll be companies, it'll be corporate policies, it'll be comms professionals. I mean, everybody has a role to play in this. It's going to be very hard. But I do think the sort of the good guy AI companies are hugely important. Back there? Yeah.
Okay. So we know that AI is only as reliable as its inputs. So how are we controlling for bias in those inputs and making sure that as we're talking about how beautiful the future of AI could be, that it doesn't repeat or exacerbate some of the existing bias in communications?
Yeah, it's a super hard question. It's a really important question. I think we've seen from all past AI that it can reflect biases, right? If you have a classic examples, if you have a sentencing algorithm, you base it on historical data, you'll get a racist sentencing algorithm. So, and every single company that builds an AI algorithm, faces that. You have an insurance algorithm, like maybe it will be biased, against women because of the way your insurance used to work, or maybe it will be biased against men, which creates an interesting, complexity. Do you allow a biased algorithm if it's correcting a societal injustice? But I think what you have to do is you have to audit the data as best as possible. You have to audit, so you audit the inputs, you audit the processes, and you audit the outputs to make sure that you're not perpetuating societal biases. But then I think another important step is the goal of an AI. I think if you set the goal of an AI as perfection or completely without bias, you may slow it too much, but you set the goal as much better than humans, then you're in a better place. Like the classic example here is self-driving cars. If self-driving cars become 80% safer than humans, do you allow them on the road, or do you wait till they're 100% safer than humans? And I think that with biases, eyes wide open to the inputs, the processes, and the outputs, but also reflecting that you will not reach perfection is likely the way to go.
For those of us who used to work with self-driving cars, we appreciate that answer. I think this is literally all the time we have, so I want to thank Paul and Arun for having us.
One more?
We have one more question. Okay, one more.
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, this is really loud. I'm currently a senior in college studying communication with a concentration in PR, and I'm actually taking a class on AI and public relations next semester. So I wanted to know what you guys would consider key concepts for young PR professionals to keep in mind as they're trying to learn how to use this new tool.
Great question, Corey.
My own view of that would be to fail fast. I think that's actually what's happening inside of companies, inside of agencies, in the academic environment. I mean, this is how innovation pushes forward. This is how we actually land on a useful square, is to fail really quickly. So my own view, dating back to our time at Google, was that we were pushing the team inside that company really hard to use the tools, figure out what their sort of useful parameters were, and then fail quickly, like test the boundaries as quickly as possible to sort of go to the next possible place. And I'm pretty convinced that your generation and the generation that comes behind you will be so much more conversant with the tools, so much better at prompt engineering than we are, just to use one example, that I think it will carry both the craft and the entire profession to a place that's a lot more useful and works at the speed of the internet in the future.
I would just say, learn all the tools, learn a ton about it, and then talk that up like crazy in your interviews. You will get hired so fast at someplace great. There's a 95% chance you're gonna have a job offer before you leave, so don't walk out quickly.
Meet a lot of people, that's why they're here. Anyway, thank you everybody for having us today.
Thank you. All right, that was really fun. Thanks, Corey, that was great.